Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. We're just going to give a moment for everybody to populate the Zoom room. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar today. My name's Laura Katawaki, and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar. The topic of the webinar is supporting communities during weather-related emergencies. And I think as we've all seen in recent years in BC, that there's been a growing number of emergencies, whether that be fires, floods, heat dome, ice storms, or other weather-related emergencies. So we've really seen an increase in the need for communities and individuals to be prepared. And so today in this webinar, we're going to be exploring some of the work that United Way BC has been doing in this area, as well as some information about work community organizations are doing, and then also sharing a little bit of information about a forthcoming guidebook that we'll be releasing on emergency preparedness. Next slide. And before we get started with the webinar, I would like to acknowledge the homelands of the Indigenous peoples of this place we now call Canada, and honor the many territorial keepers of the lands on which we work. And today I'm personally working on the lands of the Coquitlam First Nation, and these are their traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories. And I'd like to thank the Coquitlam First Nation who continue to live on these lands and also who continue to care for them along with the waters and all that's above and below. And while I'm acknowledging the lands that I'm working and residing on today, I'd also like to acknowledge some of the work that's being done by First Nations communities in the area of emergency preparedness and management. And we have seen that historically there have been some disparities in terms of access to resources needed for emergency management and preparedness in First Nations communities. And this was really highlighted, for example, in the 2017 and 2018 wildfires in BC. And there were a number of reports that were put out by First Nations communities and others highlighting these issues and the fact that they were being disproportionately affected. And so in 2019, there actually was a Tripatriot Emergency Services Memorandum of Understanding that was signed by the First Nations Leadership Council, as well as BC and the Government of Canada, in order to increase emergency management capacity of First Nation communities. And so there has been additional work and investments done since that time. And one example is the development of an action plan for disaster risk reduction by First Nations in BC for 2023 to 2030. And this was produced by the BC Assembly of First Nations. And so I would encourage you after the webinar, if you're interested in the topic, to look into some of the work that's being done by First Nations communities locally or at the provincial level in the work of emergency management. Next slide. And so a few quick housekeeping items for the webinar. So during the webinar, everyone who's not a presenter is going to be muted. Feel free, if you'd like, to introduce yourself in the chat box. For example, you could put in your name, your pronouns, your organization, the territories that you're calling from, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. If you'd like to turn on the closed captioning feature, you can do that using the button at the bottom of the toolbar. And so in the Zoom toolbar, you'll see there's a CC button, which will show closed captions. These are automatic captions. produced by Zoom, so they might not be 100% accurate, but feel free to turn on this feature if you would like. There will be a brief question period at the end of the presentation, but also please feel free to use the Q&A box during the presentation if you need to ask any questions. And this webinar is being recorded, just so you know, and we'll be posting the recording and also the slides on Healthy Aging Core. Next slide. And so before we get started with the webinar, I just thought I'd give a few little facts to kind of set the stage for why this is such an important and timely topic. And so you can see here on this slide, this is information from the government of BC about the 2024 seasonal outlook. And you can see in the text here, it says, the April survey shows that the overall snowpack level for BC is at 63% of normal, which is the lowest in 50 years. So there really is an expectation that this year in the spring and summer, there's going to be potentially drought and also a significant fire season. And so I think we all know from past years how devastating that can be. And that really increases the significance of being prepared and engaging in emergency preparedness. Next slide. And I just want to provide one other statistic. So of course, we do know that there are going to be weather-related emergencies coming up in the summer and potentially in other months as well. And data from Statistics Canada shows that only about 1 in 4 Canadians have actually engaged in emergency preparedness planning. And so that means 76% or 3/4 have not. And so obviously that's something that we would like to see addressed and increased. And so today then, in this webinar, you'll be hearing more about the work that is being done to address emergency preparedness and also ways that people can get involved and engage in this planning themselves. Next slide. All right, and so now without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter and then hand it over to him. So our presenter today is Aman Fazal. He's the coordinator for emergency response and partnerships at United Way, British Columbia. He's been a community volunteer for over 25 years, and in this capacity, he's worked on various projects to serve the needs of members of all ages in the community. And so in his various volunteer roles, he's had the opportunity to work on projects regarding event planning and execution, safety and security, and also community-based emergency preparedness and response. And in addition to his work at United Way, British Columbia, Aman is also currently a member of the AgaCon Council for British Columbia. And so I'd like to turn over the presentation now to Aman, and thank you very much for agreeing to join us today.
Great. Thanks very much, Laura, for that introduction and for all the information you provided beforehand. I think how Laura has opened up just really speaks to the importance of this topic, and I'm hoping that in our next 51-ish minutes together, I'm able to do justice to, or at least scrape the surface of, again, what's a very important topic. I do want to start on a little bit of a lighter note and re-emphasize the importance of being prepared for an emergency and the fact that emergencies can take all shapes, forms, sizes. Laura doesn't have internet at home right now, but because of her emergency plan at home, she's joined through a personal hotspot from her phone and was able to deliver these opening remarks. So Laura, a big thank you to you. But again, it just, on a very light note, just goes to show that we always need a plan B. And thankfully, Laura had a plan B, and I know others on the team had a bit of a plan C or D if we needed it. So with that, again, a very warm welcome and good afternoon to all of you. You heard earlier a little bit about my background and my role with United Way BC. And so what I'm hoping to share today is a little bit about how United Way British Columbia supports communities during weather-related emergencies. But I also wanted to take a bit of time toward the end to understand what some of the needs might be in community so that we can take that back to our team to better understand how we can build on this support. So a brief agenda. Again, I'm going to speak at a very high level briefly on how United Way BC responds in certain emergencies and how we aim to fill some of the gaps that might exist in community. Some of you on this webinar might be aware, and some of you might actually be recipients of the Emergency Preparedness and Response Grant for the CBSS sector, or the community-based senior services sector. This grant call was last year, and I did want to take a bit of time today to share some high-level results of what we saw happen in community from that grant, and lastly, speak to some of the supports and resources that are coming for this season. At a very high level, United Way British Columbia, in an emergency, we have what we call our emergency response playbook. This is an internal mechanism that we use to process some of our key decisions and determine what level of support we are able to provide in a community. As I'm sure all of you can appreciate, last fire season was a big one, so we were pretty well all hands on deck. It was actually the first time as an organization where we truly used this playbook, and it helped us in a lot of our key decisions, and it helped us operate and ultimately helped us release some funding, as again, maybe some on this call were the recipients of. So what we've got in place right now is for some of our partners in the community within our organization, we have key contacts. Our hope is that in the middle of a fire, in the middle of a flood, in the middle of whatever type of emergency we might be facing, we don't want individuals or organizations to be hearing from 3, 4, 5 different people at United Way BC to ask, are you okay and what do you need? We're hoping to streamline that conversation so that we can better understand what the needs are and help you fill some of those gaps. So we have a key contact that would reach out to our partners and do a quick needs assessment to see where, again, we can support. And then we have those ongoing check-ins. That's very, very much how we responded during the wildfires. And you'll see in the upcoming slides what that meant for us and for the community. For us, one of the really unique things about United Way British Columbia and how we are able to support the community in a response is actually this slide here. There are not a lot of agencies who have this level of connectivity in the community. We are embedded in community, and as a result, we are able to not only engage with our partners and folks that or organizations that we fund. We also have helpline services, formerly known as BC 211. We're able to, through the process I just identified, talk through what some of the needs are in the community and identify some of the gaps that may exist. Through nobody's fault, everybody's got a different scope, but we know that there are gaps, and so we do our best to try and fill those because we have staff on the ground. We work all year round on recruitment of our volunteers and an engagement of our volunteers, as well as more recently, a higher priority on an Indigenous engagement strategy. We've learned a lot over these last couple of years, especially last wildfire season. And so we've done a lot of work with our Indigenous priorities team to make sure that we're doing a good job engaging a variety of Indigenous communities. In the 2023 wildfires, here's just I won't read through kind of point by point, and I know webinars are slightly different because you can't see everybody's faces. So I don't know if everyone's smiling or if everyone is following along. So I'll assume that you can see these slides, and I know they'll be available as part of the recording. But as a bit of an example, I see a thumbs up, I appreciate that. But you'll see here during the wildfires, there was a variety of activity that was funded through some of the grants that we made available, including some organizations adding outreach hours so that they could visit door to door some of the seniors and other vulnerable individuals in their community. There was some organizations who launched emergency navigation services to, again, help those in the community understand what resources were out there. There were a lot of critical needs that came forward almost immediately, whether it was gas cards for generators, emergency food. I saw a request for diapers, etc. So those type of kind of more immediate needs, we are able to intervene and provide when we have the opportunity and when needed. We also have staff, as I mentioned, because we are embedded in community. We have staff that are in communication with our partners year round, not just in emergencies. And so our hope is that through this process, some of those relationships are already so sound that in the event of an emergency, it's as easy as picking up the phone and saying, "Hey, we need this," or "Hey, this is what our community is dealing with. What supports are available." And while a lot of what I'm sharing today sounds a lot like our work is in the actual response, the bulk of our work actually comes during recovery and building resiliency. So through our local love grants and through other community initiatives, we are there, year round, not just in the emergency, but we're there to support during recovery and ultimately to build resilience in those impacted communities. So as I mentioned, some of you may be familiar with the Emergency Preparedness and Response Grant that was available for the CBSS sector last summer. Some of the activities that we found that were funded were the distribution of emergency kits. A lot of organizations did workshops. We had many organizations opening cooling centers. When this grant first launched, we saw a lot of requests for funding come in to create some type of checklist or some type of guidebook that could be distributed within communities to help seniors better prepare for an emergency. And so what we thought is, rather than having 10 or 15 different guidebooks out there, why not bring a few organizations together to create one guidebook? And this has been quite a process, and I know many of you on this call are probably familiar with the work that's gone on in this guidebook. Some of you have been involved, but I'll speak a little bit more to this guidebook. But again, just wanted to kind of lay some of that ground about this grant call is actually where we found that need, or where we discovered that this guidebook could be beneficial. Before sharing a summary, maybe I'll just do a quick 1-minute pause and invite those of you on the call who have access in your chat, if you could take a wild and crazy guess what the #1 funded activity was from these grants. I'd be curious to know what some of your thoughts are. Maybe over the next minute you can populate that and just take a guess. I'll share with you right after that the top 3 funded, but again, curious based on your own experiences, gaps maybe that you're feeling. What are some things you feel like were the top activities? So I'm seeing one, the creation of cooling spaces and or distribution of emergency kits, hotel costs, cooling centers, again, hotel stays, swimming pool, food, emergency kits, food distribution. Yeah, so transportation, that's a good one. Communication channels. Yeah, we noticed a lot of organizations. There were close to 70 organizations funded for a variety of work, and many of them had all of these factors listed. Communication throughout the community to make sure that everybody was okay, and that we had a database of seniors who needed support, equipment. All of that absolutely falls in within. Here's a quick a map to show where these grants were distributed. You'll see it was pretty much all over British Columbia, but of course there's a kind of a higher population in kind of the south of the province here. So the top 3 activities that were funded, drum roll as there's a delay in my slide. The top 3 in this order: workshops, the distribution of emergency kits, and a community plan. So primarily, one of the gaps that was identified that, again, this grant helped address was the creation of workshops and info sessions to make sure that the community was prepared and had everything that they needed, and seniors ultimately had what they needed to make sure that they could survive in a disaster. The creation of emergency kits. This bucket, if you will, covers both the creation of emergency kits for people to keep at home, as well as the creation of emergency kits that some organizations had on hand and then distributed or planned to distribute through an emergency. And then lastly, a community plan. Many organizations came forward saying, look, we don't really know how to or have a process in place to get a hold of the seniors to make sure that they're okay. We don't really know what to do or where to direct them. We don't really have a well thought out plan to support seniors. So these funding dollars were put toward exactly that, is creating this plan so that the entire community would feel supported, and there was more of a coordinated response in a disaster, in an emergency. Some quick examples here of some of the workshops that, again, I think there might even be some representatives from these workshops on the call or on the webinar today. But a variety of workshops that we saw take place, and you can see right here the lots of people took advantage of those. One testimonial I wanted to share, which again I won't read out, but I'll summarize for you at a high level, where one individual says that her husband had recently passed, and he was the one that would typically be responsible in the household. You know, he'd be the one that would make sure there was an emergency kit, or make sure that that they had a plan. But since he had passed, you know, she felt somewhat empowered after learning, after going through this workshop, to do that for herself, and to make sure that she was prepared. So this is just one of many kind of impact stories that we saw in the community that was made possible thanks to some of the funding and some of the activities that were made available for the community. So I'd like to open it up, and some of you may have your phones on hand. Some of you can of course access the link there, and feel free also to use the chat. But I'd love to hear from those of you on the call here. What are some best practices, or some promising practices that you've witnessed in your organization, or that you partake in? Things that maybe you've seen others do. But we'd love to use this opportunity to share what you feel is really working out there in the community as it relates to emergency preparedness, response, and recovery for older adults. I'll pause here for about 30 seconds to give you a chance to scan the QR code. And actually, maybe what I'll also do is, while you're doing that, I'll put a link in the Zoom chat as well. There's the link, and oh, great. I'm seeing things populate, so I'm just going to switch which screen you can see, so you can see some of these things come up. We'll monitor the chat. So maybe let's take the next minute or so to populate. And I'm just going to do a quick scan in the chat. Oh, there's a question here about BC 211 changing, more of a rebrand to BC 211. The phone number is still 211. We refer to it as Helpline Services, since it's kind of been umbrellaed under United Way BC. There's a question about partners. You speak about connecting with community partners. Who are those partners? Do they initiate contact with United Way, or other way around? It's usually both ways. So either it's through some of our funding relationships, or some of our outreach, but definitely if there's folks who reach out to us as well, but it's primarily through our funded programs. The second part of that question is, are you in contact with local governments? Local governments and EOCs. Yes, we are, both during as well as during an emergency, as well as even times like now, participating in roundtables and some of the prep work. So looking at our board here, some of the promising practices that we're seeing: multi-agency collaboration, absolutely. Air conditions equipment is a big one. We're collaborating with many organizations, the health authority, the district, and the general public for our emergency preparedness event on the 11th. Great. So what I'm seeing at a quick scan, and maybe I can lean on the Healthy Aging core team to share this board as part of the recording to the webinar, so that it's available. for everyone to see and maybe get ideas from. But what I'm seeing a lot of is a lot of partnerships, a lot of collaboration, and that really has been part of the spirit of why of how we do a lot of our work and where we ultimately want to get, especially for the CBSS sector, is making sure that our responses um, are collaborative, and you know, it's not one agency is doing this and others doing this, the province is doing this, and everyone's kind of all over the place. But we've always aimed to have a collaborative approach. So I really appreciate that many are saying that, you know, a promising practice is partnering with others, including health authorities, to make sure that we're delivering this in a unified manner. I saw transportation mentioned. I saw neighbors helping neighbors help mentioned in the chat, which is such a great point. You know, the community coming together, or us coming together as you know, neighbors or residents, really is how we will be able to support. I remember reading a stat that said, you know, in an emergency, it could take first responders up to a week to actually come to us, because, you know, naturally there might be that they'll have to triage based on what else is happening and who else is injured. And so you know, neighbors supporting one another, or doing check-ins is absolutely a great example of a practice of community coming together. Thank you all for your input there. And again, I think we'll have that available. Sorry, Laura,
And
I see you on screen.
I was going to ask, before going on, there were a couple more questions in the chat from earlier. Did you want to answer them now or wait till the end?
I can answer them now.
I
If
can
you
read them to you if you'd like.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so somebody asked whether the emergency preparedness grants are going to be offered again this year.
We don't know yet. We haven't received information about that, so stay tuned. But we haven't received information around grants like that one. There may be funding available in an emergency for more, I guess, more response work, but I haven't seen anything come out about similar grants like the last one.
All right, thanks for that. And then there was also a question, who is the key contact for North Peace and Northern Rockies?
I would have to take that one away with my team. So I see Susan Adams asked that. Maybe Laura, would it maybe be best if we gave Susan maybe my email address, and then I can find out and then reach out.
Yeah, for sure. And there were also two questions in the Q&A box. So how does United Way identify who the key contact is who will reach out to agencies?
Who will reach out to agencies? We typically do it by so the way that our staff is set up, we're set up kind of regionally. So it's usually the local person who lives or who lives and works out of a particular area or region becomes the key contact where that organization might be located.
Okay, great. And then the last question was, how have organizations supported older adults with complex care needs during emergencies? And what would you say are the gaps or challenges?
I think that from what I've experienced and heard about, and even feedback I've received, I think that in itself is a large gap. I think a lot of organizations, including ours, are trying to figure out still what the best way is to support those who are, you know, who might need the most support during an emergency. I think resources like the guidebook, for example, that I'll speak to shortly, certainly are an attempt to help and help those seniors and their support network think about what additional things need to be prepared, or what, you know, what do I need to start thinking through ahead of time. So I think that's an attempt. I haven't seen, you know, I haven't seen anything necessarily that stands out to me that says, you know, this is a great promising practice that one organization is doing that everybody should be doing. But I know it is a big gap that a lot of folks have identified.
All right, thanks so much for answering those questions. We've got a very active chat, so I just want to make
Um,
sure that they didn't get lost later on. So thank
Thanks,
you.
Laura. No, I appreciate that. Thanks very much. And yeah, please keep the questions coming. If I miss them, I'm sorry. Laura will keep me on top of it. Okay. So moving on then to some of what's coming, and some of the supports that we anticipate having available for this wildfire season and for this summer. Firstly, we've spoken about the guidebook for older adults, which I'll go into a little bit more depth on shortly. We've also, based on that guidebook, created a similar guidebook that's available, that'll be available for all communities, that speaks more to kind of a general vulnerable population. So not only seniors or not only older adults, but more generally to vulnerable populations who may have additional needs during an emergency. We are planning to create workshops that are meant to be kind of 30 to 45 minutes. They can be solo workshops or additions to workshops that will support agencies in rolling this guidebook out and helping seniors and others fill out this guidebook. It's meant to be very much it's meant very much to be tailored or personalized to the person using it. And so these workshops will help facilitate that. We've also under the United Way BC Healthy Aging team and the Community-Based Senior Services Leadership Council created the Emergency Preparedness Response and Recovery for Older Adults Working Group. That group helps drive our work and helps helps really determine what our work plan is specifically to support the CBSS sector. And so through members of United Way BC, through members of the Leadership Council, if there are certain inputs that you have, then please do feel free to filter those forward. But we do have a group that meets on a cadence to make sure that that this work is looked after. So onto the guidebook, which we're expecting will launch next week as part of Emergency Preparedness Week. It'll be live on Healthy Aging Core as well as on the United Way BC website and social media. This guidebook, as I mentioned, is something that again we discovered the need for when we launched the grant. And we found that there was a guidebook that was actually created in 2014 by the Maple Ridge Pitt Meadows Catesy Seniors Network, thanks to the work of Barb Morgan and others on her team. And what we were able to do with their support, along with a few other organizations, is come together and revise this guidebook to be, to add 2014. A lot has changed in the last 9-10 years. And so we've made some adjustments to be more up to date with some of the emergencies or some of the disasters that we're seeing that are weather related here in British Columbia. And so that guidebook has been updated. It'll be ready for distribution, digital distribution next week. And we're now working through getting printed copies out into the community with the support of United Way BC staff as well as the Leadership Council. We do have future plans. The guidebook that's being released next week is in English, but we do have translations in progress, as well as, now that we'll have this available as a foundation, we'll be able to build from that and have inserts from organizations like Alzheimer's Society of BC and others to make this guidebook more comprehensive and more hopefully usable for those who have extreme needs, as Laura's question alluded to earlier. I've taken a couple of screenshots from the guidebook to give you a sense of the type of content that'll be in there, or what you can expect will be in there. And so there's the table of contents here that shows, initially, of course, the introduction, and just talks a little bit about, really just sets the stage about why this is so important and why this level of preparedness is important for all of us, and what we're preparing, what we're preparing for in terms of whether it's extreme weather, cold, wildfire, earthquake. British Columbia has seen it all, unfortunately, and that will continue. And so it also then goes into, again, just the different steps that we should take, or the different things that we want to have in place for these types of emergencies. We go into then getting an emergency kit. Now, we know that emergency preparedness is not a one-size-fits-all. It's not like you can go to the local drugstore, pick up an emergency kit, put it in a closet, and say, I'm prepared. There are elements of that kit that you need to personalize to make your own. There are parts of that kit that you may need to add to. Maybe you need to add your medication, or maybe you need to add insulin, or maybe you need to add extra batteries for a hearing aid. And so those types of thoughts and additional checklist items are covered as a way to trigger some thinking for folks using this guidebook. We also lay out creating that kit as, again, a little bit of a checklist And then on the right-hand side, you see an excerpt of a page where because we knew that, or we wanted that ideally this be distributed all over British Columbia, creating a guidebook that's, everything's already kind of programmed in, that tells you the name of the community, where the nearest reception center is, what the local radio station is. We didn't want to just give it out and again, it's you set it and forget it. We wanted this to be an opportunity for seniors to take their own preparedness into their own hands, and where available, do some of this research, but also the workshops that we alluded to earlier. During those workshops, you can actually take the time to fill out some of this key information so that everybody has it and goes home with a complete guidebook that they've worked through and hopefully made their own. There's a list of some provincial resources that are available for everyone. Again, I've taken an excerpt, but you'll see here on the right-hand side, it's broken down by emergency or by type of emergency. And so the example that I've shared here is wildfire, and just again, the various steps that you can take or should take at home to make sure that if you are in a wildfire hot zone, that you've taken these steps to be better prepared. Some additional examples of the considerations for those who have extra equipment like hearing or vision, or even a service animal. Just again, what to include as part of your grab and go bag so that it's ready, that's ready to go if you do need to evacuate. Okay, I'm going to open it up for another question here. You've heard a little bit about what how United Way BC responds. We've heard some best practices. We've heard what's coming in terms of supports, as well as this guidebook and some of these workshops. I'd love to open it back up to see what gaps may exist that you're noticing. That again we can support. As I mentioned, we have this working group under the Leadership Council, as well as, of course, we have our network at United Way BC that I'd love to be able to take information back to share that members of the community are facing some of these challenges and seeing some of these gaps. So if I could ask you, you could feel free to scan the QR code again, or I will I'll repaste the link in the chat so that you have it handy, and then I will bring up the results. Feel free again to use the chat as a way to respond. If that's easier for you, you can share in any way. This one's going to come up as a word cloud. So hopefully in the next kind of 30 seconds or so, we'll see some more responses come through to hopefully then be able to see what some of the biggest gaps are. Transportation, I know, is a big one. Communication, access to information, isolated communities, that's a big one, no doubt. Just while these come in, I'm catching up on the chat here, and I see that oh, food security, yeah. Accommodation is another tough one. Okay, while the rest come in, I did just want to take a few minutes uh, to address some of these gaps that are being listed because I think they're all important, and maybe if it's helpful, I'm happy to spend a couple of minutes just sharing what we saw, even as part of the grants and some of the programs that were launched. Because many of what's being shared here, or much of what's being shared here, there might be some things that we can borrow. Both transportation and communication are ones that seem to be coming up quite prominently. And so, as it relates to transportation, I will share that as we were going through the final reports of the grants, there were a few instances where transportation came up, primarily transportation to cooling centers. Um, and there was volunteer support leverage there as well as community buses leveraged there. What I found very interesting about communication in terms of again what I saw come out of these grants is that some some have actually taken a bit of time over these last few months to develop a what's the word, like a database or a registry of seniors kind of in and around the area, to who would ultimately opt in to get wellness checks or to get communication during an emergency. So that was one great practice that we saw from these. And so what they were able to do during an emergency is activate a call tree in multiple languages, to check in on these individuals and make sure that communication was clear. The other kind of, I know it's only one word, so I'm pulling a few different meanings. That's communication with seniors. The other big gap that we saw in communication was that between, you know, kind of response agencies, if you will, if you want to call us, like United Way BC, and those who are actually dealing with these emergencies on the ground, like yourselves, because you know any agency is so involved in actually in responding and supporting those in need. You don't always have time to answer your emails that come from us. You don't always have time to pick up the phone calls that come from us. And so on our end, I know we're certainly doing our best, as I mentioned earlier, to keep that to a minimum so we can focus on what the actual needs are. But I do see a lot of room for improvement in communication, which again we are working toward. So I'm gonna take a couple from the chat here. Heat response continues to be a challenge. Elders with Alzheimer's, absolutely. I think that that is one area that those who have certainly the guidebook does its best to address those, at least identifying those extra needs for those who have them. But there are very specific groups like elders with Alzheimer's or other diseases that there just hasn't been a lot of work to done, I think, to identify or to resolve that gap. Okay, Laura, any questions that I'm missing?
There was one, it was more of a comment, but I think it's kind of a question as well. And a person was saying that they live in a seniors housing building and they were hoping there would be an opportunity to order these emergency preparedness guides in bulk. So maybe you could tell a little bit more about how people might be able to access them in the future if they're interested in getting copies.
Sure. I think thanks for catching that, Laura. For We are working through printed distribution, and so for now, what I would say is that the digital copies will be available, and of course, you're welcome to print them. The guidebook is pretty like it's about 40 pages, so it's not necessarily something you would um, maybe print in bulk for the first round. We are working with a team to figure out how to get printed copies into community as quickly as possible. Again, we will lean on folks on our leadership council as well as United Way BC staff. We may not necessarily do an order system, but perhaps distribution through community agencies for a first round, and then have it available again for continued download. The PDF is a fillable one, so for those who are comfortable with technology, you can also fill it out on the computer. So I would say stay tuned on Healthy Aging Core as well as the United Way BC website for more information on the printed copies. but those soft copies will hopefully help us begin some of that planning. Okay, I think everybody has, oh yeah, sorry, Laura, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that was all the questions I saw in the chat. So thank you very
Okay,
much.
wonderful. And I think everyone's input some of the gaps. Feel free to keep, to keep inputting, because we will use that information to think through what some of our work is. I realized that there was one part of the guidebook that I did want to focus a little, spend a couple more minutes on, that I maybe I sped through too quickly. So I just would love to bring that back up here. So the other kind of addition, if you will, or at least the more specification on this particular guidebook that may not necessarily be there in others or in or parts of other checklists is this piece here around those with disabilities. And we wanted to include this again to make sure that those who have perhaps additional mobility equipment or have additional, we keep calling them needs, but who have additional needs, this is all hopefully there to help you think through this. And through that workshop, that's the benefit of having this workshop, is it allows people to start thinking for themselves. We know that the number one person that can respond to an emergency best is yourself. You have to have a plan for yourself. And so we're hoping that this guidebook will again just trigger some of that thinking, and will allow for discussion. And maybe even if you have a group of 10 or 15, 20, 30 people in that workshop, it'll allow some sharing of, well, I do this for my emergency plan, or my son or my daughter or my spouse has this set up for me. Have you tried that? Do you have an Apple Watch that detects, if you're in an emergency, or if you've fallen or something like that? So again, the workshop is meant to help think through some of these items, but also share some of those common practices amongst peers. So Laura, if I think we've addressed kind of some of the main points around the guidebook, and so I've got some time set aside for questions. I know we've been going at them as they come up, but I'm happy to open it up for questions and discussion now.
Yeah, great. So we'd invite anybody who has a question to put that in the Q&A box or the chat. And just so folks know, for the chat, we will be sharing, because I know there's a lot of great information that's been put in there. We'll be collecting that as well and putting it in with the Mentimeter information, so you'll have access to all the wonderful ideas that have been shared in the chat as well. All right, I'll give everyone, we already have a question in the Q&A. So, developing and maintaining current information in a vulnerable individual registry when there are privacy, liability, and maintenance concerns needs guidance and liaisons with emergency management professionals, so volunteers can activate in a coordinated way. How can we do this?
Yeah, that is a very fair and valid question. I think so. I would say two things. Now, I do want to preface by saying I'm no privacy expert. I'm sharing just what I've seen, how I've seen other agencies do it, and it's been as simple as collecting that data using a form, whether it's a digital form or a paper form, that provides consent to contact in an event of an emergency. And so what I've seen is it's actually specified that this contact information that you're sharing is only for use in an emergency. We're not going to, sell it to a business, or we're not going to use it if we want to promote some of our programming to you. It's specific to emergency. So that's one way that agencies and organizations protect themselves, but also protect, in this case, the seniors, and help them feel comfort that their phone number is not just going to be out there. I would say if you are collecting information, it does require some consultation with a privacy expert, or perhaps even a legal expert in your organization if you have one, or if you're connected to one. But that's one example of how I've seen that handled, is just being very specific about how you plan to use that information.
Great, thank you very much for that answer. And I'll give a moment to see if there's any other questions. And one additional question that I'll just put out to you is maybe you could talk a little bit about the more generic emergency preparedness support guide that's also being released by United Way BC, because I think that might be interest perhaps to the audience as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's content-wise, it's somewhat similar in terms of trying to trigger the right questions and trying to have the right backup plans in place for those who might have additional support needs. That is also going to be available in printed as well as soft copy. Um, for our for the folks that received a grant during the last wildfire season, they've already gotten soft copies of this through email. But we're also again working through hard copy distribution. I saw a comment in the chat around libraries being and malls perhaps being an opportunity for distribution. I love that idea. I think once we figure out how many we are able to get printed, we would look at kind of mass distribution opportunities like that. So I really appreciate that suggestion.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing that additional information. And then this isn't a question, but there's been quite a few comments in the chat coming up from rural or more isolated communities discussing challenges that might be encountered due to their isolation or the lack of evacuation routes that might be feasible during an emergency. And I'm wondering if you've come up with any across any information in your collection of data from community organizations about challenges similar to that or potential solutions.
You know, not anything that comes to mind right away, but what I would love to share is that that was one area that we identified when creating this guidebook was something that we wanted to try really hard to make sure that there was inclusion for rural and remote communities. And what we found is that every community, as I'm sure everyone on this webinar can appreciate, every community is so different that to try and capture all this in a guidebook, we'd have like a 500-page guidebook and it would all be different information. And so that's partially that's partially what led to the decision around leaving a lot of the guidebook to be fillable, so that it's relevant for those particular communities. And that's where even in some of the some of the grants, this workshop approach was most appreciated and most effective because it brought folks of that community together, who better understood their own community, who understood what resources were available and allowed sharing. So that was one way that we found that rather than us providing these resources to a community that we may not have a presence in or we may not have an understanding of, is us providing or helping facilitate that type of discussion was probably more effective than any other way.
Great. Thanks for that additional information about how the guidebooks are customizable. And I think I don't think there's any other questions in the chat, though I see people are still putting in comments. So I'm
That's
glad to
me.
see that this topic is so inspiring and of such interest to everyone who's attended the webinar. And there's actually a message from somebody about whether perhaps United Way BC could support a Zoom meeting amongst those who live and work in remote areas to share with one another what we do in our remote communities to address these issues. So that's a food for thought for your team, Aman.
Yeah, I love that idea. I know, again, some of you may have participated, but when in a previous life, I was on the healthy aging team at United Way BC, and we held a provincial consultation specifically around emergency preparedness when we first went into this work. And we brought, I think it was something like 120 individuals together to share some of these best practices. So I love that idea. Maybe that's something, or that is something I will take away, and maybe something we can all partner on.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I see that we're almost at the very end of our time. So I'd just like to take this time now to really thank you, Amon, for sharing all this wonderful information and insights from the emergency preparedness work that you've been doing, for engaging with the audience and listening and taking in all the ideas. I'm glad that you've been able to share so much, and also the audience has obviously been able to share a lot with you. And we're really looking forward to, I think, the guidebooks. You can see there's lots of people who are just eager to get their hands on it. So for the webinar, of course, we will be sharing the recording for everyone. The slides, of course, the guidebooks are going to be forthcoming, and there'll be more information about how you can eventually get printed copies and additional information in the future. So I think we definitely have that interest in continuing that conversation with all the people who are here today on the webinar. And I'll let Amon chime in if you have any last words.
Well, I didn't plan any last words, but just a lot of gratitude to everyone for taking the time to join. I really appreciate the dialogue on this chat. There's so many wonderful bits of information here. So I don't think there is much else to say other than go Canucks go.
Excellent ending message. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. We hope that you have a wonderful time. And I'll just highlight one additional comment that was made in the chat, which was by Olivia, our Assistant Director of Community Engagement. And she notes that there will be a session focused on emergency preparedness and response at the upcoming Provincial Summit on Aging from November 5th to 7th. So keep your eye out for that in your calendars as well. All right. And in that case, thank you everyone for joining us today for this wonderful webinar, and thank you for your wonderful presentation, Aman. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. All right, take care, everyone.